When I was growing up, I always looked forward to the hotter months of the year. Being a June baby, I always associated the joy of growing up with the heat of the sun, backyard barbecues, social gatherings, freedom from school, and being a California child, the relief of a beach or the stateside escapes of theme parks where I could lay aside reality and bask in the sensation of growing up. As I got older and less comfortable with myself and my body nearing the overlooming anxiety prison that was to become high school, plus becoming a natural emotional hand grenade during my teenage years, I began to drift away from the appreciation of the heat and fell more towards a love for the cold, cloudy, and the melancholy. The heat of the summer became oppressive, and the chill of the autumn and winter months of the year began to become my embrace that made me feel like I was emotionally home again. It was at this time that I discovered Silent Hill 2 and its cold, desolate, isolating variant on horror. I had only really been exposed to the jump scare and single-note tension-filled Resident Evil by that point, and this introspective, almost video game turned novel view on horror really turned my world upside down. After Silent Hill 2, I forever associated the feeling of melancholy and horror to no longer be mutually exclusive. But even comparing just the first 4 games, I think it's commendable to the original team that each experience stands out on its own merits, despite that 3 of them use the same exact template. Silent Hill 1 is not unlike the nightmare of a child. It uses your fear of the dark to well effect. Its overabundance of rust and blood, metal, and industrial soundscapes bring to mind a clear definition of what a true nightmare feels like. You are thrown into chaos, and despite the occasional respites of quiet, fog-induced reflection, a majority of the time that you spend in the town is fighting against a demonic presence that does not hesitate to let itself be known to you. Silent Hill 1 is like blades gently rubbing down your spine, soft enough to feel the blood trickle down your skin, but not deep enough to feel the splitting of flesh. As I said earlier, Silent Hill 2 uses its cold, isolating nature as its main use of fear, like whispers in your ear coming from directions that you can't quite pinpoint in the fog. With a lot of thematic ties to guilt, depression, regret, and more, it's easily the heaviest entry in terms of story, and in my opinion, the standout of the franchise, let alone pretty much all horror media in general. It feels incredibly depressing, which is unlike any of the games that came before or after. Silent Hill 3 is a gauntlet of pure, visceral terror. It almost never lets up on its assault of your senses. Its use of color is a visual standout from the rest of the series, and its brand of horror is complete oppression. It feels like a blaring heat wave of terror. Its fear is based on not a blade gently grazing your spine, but rather one of several knives being suspended on wires whose tips are pressing into your skin. And it's because of this that I think Silent Hill 3 is the perfect summer horror game. Silent Hill 3 is a continuation of the story of Silent Hill 1. 3 is also the only game in the franchise that is a direct sequel to another. In it, you play as Heather, a recently turned 17-year-old girl who becomes entangled in the horrific world of Silent Hill due to interjections into her life by the town's current eyebrowless cult fanatic and Tilda Swinton impersonator, Claudia, and a gruff detective, Douglas Cartland. The game revolves around you as Heather attempting to free yourself from the town's clutches in more ways than one. The story in Silent Hill 3 is a lot less of a meditation on the human condition than Silent Hill 2's story, and I think in some aspects of the end result make that decision one that I'm okay with. It would have been really tough to try to outdo the story of Silent Hill 2, but at the same time, the story is presented in such a way that it almost feels like a cheesy horror film and not really in the best of ways. I don't think that hurts the overall game because, as I'll get to it, I think it's arguably the scariest one in the franchise, but you can really imagine a horde of people in a crowded theater munching on popcorn mindlessly watching some of this game's cutscenes. Even more so than 2, for all of the silliness that you can argue that Silent Hill 2 has, I think that it's fair to argue that the team presenting that story was earnest about its tone. Silent Hill 3's tone is a lot less serious and almost teeters on farcical at points, with some objectively funny dialogue and completely ridiculous exchanges.
I am Claudia. So what?
That isn't to discredit the times where Silent Hill 3 absolutely nails its cutscenes, but I would find it hard to argue that the snarky Heather brings a lot more of a light-mannered tone throughout a lot of the game's runtime, which in my opinion sort of paints the overall narrative presentation as one of a cheesy summer horror film.
You deceived me!
I didn't deceive you.
Silent Hill 3 at its heart is a coming-of-age story. It's also the first and only in the series led by a female protagonist. The subject matter, while horrific and often suggestive of bigger and worse things, the loss of innocence, the loss of family, the pain of growing up, the pain of leaving your childhood behind, the pain of possibly giving up everything to do what you know is right. It's also quite literally about the rebirth of a god that will usher in a world of paradise, as believed by Claudia, but in reality is one that will bring about essentially hell on earth. These themes are represented throughout the gameplay and story of Silent Hill 3 through the lens of a bloodshot nightmare world, one filled with images of fire and burning hot color palettes. Growing up is a tumultuous time frame in your life, and it really does feel like the entire world is holding you up against a wall, scolding you at every turn, and your body is constantly at ends with itself. You never really quite figure out who you are during this time, but all the while you are desperately grasping at things that you know and believe, and all the while floundering at new experiences, clinging to the hope that they will make you a more unique and well-rounded individual, and this process is one of constant wheel turning, constant finding of new fixations, and relentless churning of emotions. Emotions running wild in a way that I can only describe as being emotionally on fire. The gameplay of Silent Hill 3 fits in line with the 2 games that came before it, with some mild tweaks to the already established formula. A majority of the game takes place in dungeons that are essentially just big buildings that you must explore. You must solve puzzles, plus defeat and outmaneuver monsters, which is interspersed with wandering around the foggy streets of Silent Hill. Silent Hill 3 differs slightly from this by having much less of a focus on exploring the titular town and is more focused on putting you through a hellish gauntlet through several interior areas that are never quite as fleshed out as a lot of the locations in Silent Hill 1 or 2, but help fit into the theme of oppression as you quickly go from the mall to the subway to the sewers to the office complex, and then at long last you get to explore Silent Hill proper. What this structure means, however, is that your journey throughout the actual town is greatly diminished compared to the first and second games. The locations that you explore in Silent Hill proper are limited to the hospital, the amusement park, and the church. But as I said previously, the strength of 3's structure is that you never really get enough time in most of, if not any of these locations, to gather a real comfortability with them, which puts you at a strong precipice of, well, uncomfortability. The horror of Silent Hill 3 comes down to the constant barrage of noises, monsters, and scares. Where Silent Hill 2's scares mostly come from the fear of isolation, such as whispers in the dark or subtle changes in your environment, Silent Hill 3's horror comes from a sense that the town is actively fucking with you, constantly barraging you with enemies, making you overwhelmed, and in a sense, trying to wear you down, not unlike a heat wave. There are instances of quiet, subtle uncomfortableness, yes, such as the amazing points where you hear shuffling above you in places that should be abandoned. The horrific imagery that you encounter in the other world that more often than not take place in isolation. Or the encounters with Stanley in the hospital. But even these feel oppressive. The Stanley counters specifically are ones that I want to talk about. As someone who grew up male, I would have to say that the interactions with Stanley might be the highlight of the entire game. I've never really experienced something like unwanted advances, and persistent ones at that. I would have no real way of knowing what feelings situations like these bring to the people involved. The sections with Stanley give me an inkling of what it must feel like. The dread I felt while exploring the hospital and finding another journal waiting for me, the imagery conjured up by his words, and the superficial implications of love made my skin crawl. For the first time, I had some semblance of understanding of what women must go through on an almost daily basis. It terrified me. It made me uncomfortable, and it made me feel sick. I consider it an accomplishment by the developers to allow me to experience something through the eyes of someone who I literally cannot understand in the real world. I think the most malicious thing that Silent Hill 3 manages to do is turn things that are synonymous with freedom as a teenager, which is a time in your life when you feel the first loosening of the shackles that have bound you to your home and your family for the entirety of your life at that point. With such locations like the mall, the subway, and the amusement park, and it makes them into awful nightmares that make you wish that you could go back to the comfort of your family. But even then, Silent Hill 3 rips that away from you. There is a sinister nature within Silent Hill 3 that no other game in the franchise has, except for maybe Silent Hill 4. Horror, in my opinion, is usually synonymous with the colder months of the year. When night falls earlier, the darkness surrounds us faster, and the chill of the breeze becomes a visible manifestation of your breath, and the autumn season begins to present itself in full swing. But Silent Hill 3 takes a franchise rooted in horror and makes itself known as something so monstrous, so vicious, and so sinister that I think that it transcends the chilling cold that the franchise is usually associated with, and with a story about growing up, becomes something that I think is suited perfectly for the blaring heat wave of summer. Sweating profusely at night with the fan perched by your side blowing warm air back into your face as you sip on a water bottle and witness the events of Silent Hill 3 play out before you. I would highly recommend that if you haven't given Silent Hill 3 a chance yet, to give it a try after watching this. It's not as emotionally impactful as 2, but I think that it's easily the scariest of the franchise, and is one that you will come back to now and again just to remind yourself of how good this series used to be.
Or if you'd prefer, we could come and visit you instead.
Hey, I just want to say thank you very much. If you made it to the end of the video, I really appreciate it. I don't normally do this, but if you could like, subscribe. I'm almost at 1,000, so it would mean a lot if I could hit that number before I hit my 1-year anniversary on YouTube. I love everybody who has subscribed, and I love everybody who is thinking about subscribing. And even if you're not, I love you anyway. Thanks for watching.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.